What if we've been lied to about our history? Imagine growing up hearing the same story over and over again. The Spanish were cruel oppressors and the Americans saved us from them. It's a familiar story, perhaps similar to something we heard in school, or repeated in movies, or heard from our own families and friends, or fed to us in social media as common wisdom. But what if these stories were distortions? What if it had everything to do with the so-called Leyenda Negra? What is the Leyenda Negra in the first place? Stick around as we tackle the dark secret in Philippine history hiding in plain sight. The roots of the Leyenda Negra. The term Leyenda Negra was popularized by Spanish historian Julián Juderías in his 1914 book La Leyenda Negra y la Verdad Histórica, or The Black Legend and Historical Truth. While the English translation is literally Black Legend, English speakers might be more familiar with the term Black Propaganda or Black Ops narrative. But here we'll stick with the original term instead. The Leyenda was not born in the Philippines. It was first crafted in the 16th century by Spain's Protestant adversaries, especially the English, the French, and the Dutch, to portray Catholic Spain as a ruthless colonial power guilty of unparalleled cruelty and oppressiveness. This narrative emphasized and exaggerated the worst aspects of Spanish rule related to how it interacted with the native populations and the greed of the conquistadors. While there were atrocities, yes, but the portrayals ignored the fact that other colonial powers, such as the British, Dutch, and yes, even the Americans, engaged in similar or even worse actions on their own. And yet, only Spain appears to be evil. The role of Bartolome de las Casas. Las Casas, a Spanish Dominican friar, documented Spanish abuses against indigenous peoples in Brevísima Relación de la Destrucción de las Indias, 1552, a brief account of the destruction of the Indies. Some have claimed that Las Casas may have exaggerated a bit for dramatic effect, and it's more like a homily than a history. But his work was successful in getting the Spanish monarch to effect new laws, especially the Law of the Indies in 1573, which sought to protect the natives as subjects of the King of Spain. Yes, the indigenous people, the natives, were treated as subjects of the King of Spain, not as outsiders. Anyway, his work, intended to advocate for indigenous rights, was later used by Spain's enemies to depict Spaniards as uniquely cruel colonizers. The spread of the Black Legend. The legend was perpetuated through exaggerated accounts, propaganda, and artistic depictions such as Theodore de Bry's engravings. Over time, it became ingrained in European and American narratives about Spain and its colonies. While the Filipino propaganda movement had a hand in the propagation of the Leyenda Negra, the biggest propagator of the Black Legend in Philippine history was actually the United States. Why and how exactly was this done? Well, for starters, there was a Spanish-American War in 1898. And right before hostilities started, in the so-called era of yellow journalism, the press started a propaganda campaign to provoke U.S. sympathies for Cuba and hostilities against Spain. For example, the explosion of the USS Maine in Havana Harbor on February 15, 1898, was a major casus belli for the Spanish-American War. Although the cause of the explosion was later determined to be accidental by mainstream historians, it was widely interpreted by the American public and press as Spanish sabotage. This interpretation fueled public outrage and provided a justification for war against Spain. In modern terms, think about the stories of weapons of mass destruction fueling the invasion of Iraq. It turned out that after the invasion, Iraq had no such weapons, and this paralleled the USS Maine sabotage claim as the main justification for a war against Spain. The sinking of the Maine killed over 260 sailors and was heavily publicized by yellow journalism, particularly by media moguls like William Randolph Hearst. The rallying cry, "Remember the Maine, to hell with Spain," became emblematic of the push for war. President McKinley and Congress used this event to support their decision to declare war on Spain on April 25, 1898, after failed negotiations for Spain's withdrawal from Cuba. Needless to say, the US found itself at war with Spain, which led eventually to fighting Spain in the Philippines and to eventually fighting against the Philippine revolutionaries. So clearly, Spain was the enemy. So naturally, in order to subdue the Philippines, the US took steps to consolidate its power over the country, including undertaking the following: portraying Spanish rule as medieval and tyrannical. The American colonial administration and historians like Jacob Sherman and James Leroy contributed to the notion that Spanish rule was anachronistic, tyrannical, and medieval. This narrative was used to justify American intervention. The US then presented its colonial policies as progressive compared to Spain's tyrannical rule. President William McKinley's policy of benevolent assimilation claimed to uplift Filipinos through reforms such as universal public education, infrastructure development, and local government bodies. Notwithstanding the fact that there was universal public education in the Philippines that Spain started in 1863. That there was infrastructure development and that local government bodies were already being modernized via such laws as the Maura laws of 1893 and 1894, for example. Obviously, therefore, these were self-serving arguments to portray Filipinos as unready to govern, justifying American colonial rule. We shall discuss this more in future episodes, in future videos, as these are lengthy topics on their own already, and save these topics for future discussions. Inventing Caciquism as a red herring. Leroy heavily used the term of the cacique or Caciquism, portraying it as a corrupt system inherited from the Spanish, which undermined democratic principles. This term was used to describe local political bosses and was presented as a legacy of Spanish rule. However, the US has its own history of using political bosses, and it even introduced its pork barrel politics in the Philippines in 1922. So there was nothing uniquely Hispanic about the supposed phenomenon. It is simple political reality to rely on influential local leaders for governance. That these people can amass power and wealth because of cooperation with the central authority, it's nothing but simple economic reality, and it's called rent-seeking in economics in today's language. There's nothing uniquely Hispanic about this. But no matter, it was effective propaganda to portray this as uniquely Spanish when given a Hispanic label like cacique or the caciquism. Even though, as previously mentioned, the US has something similar that it continued here. And the phenomenon has in fact a modern name, patronage politics. The 1922 Public Works Act. The US introduced the pork barrel system when it was formally introduced through the Public Works Act of 1922. This act allowed legislators to allocate funds for local projects such as police barracks, local roads, artesian wells, and telegraph lines, which required post-enactment approval from both chambers of Congress. Patronage system. The pork barrel system became a tool for patronage, allowing politicians to secure support from their constituents by funding local projects. This created a cycle of dependency and political leverage, especially for the US to get its way in the Philippines. Censorship and suppressing documents. The American colonial administration suppressed documents and censored parts of the press to control the narrative about Spanish rule and Philippine history. For example, there was no Philippine-American War because as far as the US was concerned, it was merely a Philippine insurrection rather than the continuation of the Philippine War of Independence, first versus Spain, then versus the US. Then, the United States declared victory in the Philippines on July 4, 1902, with President Theodore Roosevelt issuing an amnesty proclamation that marked the end of the conflict. However, after declaring victory, the US faced extended resistance movements similar to its modern-day experience in Iraq. For example, on May 1, 2003, US President George W. Bush declared major combat operations in Iraq over with his mission accomplished speech. However, the US continued military operations in Iraq for nearly 8 years after this declaration until the final withdrawal of US troops in December 2011. Something similar happened here in the Philippines around 100 years earlier. In the Philippines, guerrilla warfare persisted despite formal declarations of victory and persisted for a couple of years more, leading to the operations against Macario Saka in Luzon, who was treated as a bandit rather than the last of the few revolutionaries of the time, and he was executed as a mere bandit. It's surprising to find out that a lot of Filipinos accept this US version of Philippine history, and many don't believe that there was a Philippine-American War in the first place, where anywhere between 300,000 to a million people are believed to have died, out of a population estimate of anywhere between 7 to 10 million. So if one thinks about it, more Filipinos died in the Philippine-American War than the 3 centuries of Spanish rule. Misrepresenting Spanish modernity. The American narrative often denied the modernizing effects of the late Spanish period, instead emphasizing a dark age of Spanish rule. This distorted the historical records by ignoring reforms and progress made during the Spanish era. For example, the Mara Law of 1893. This law aimed to reform and strengthen local government structures in the Philippines by establishing more autonomous municipal governments. It was intended to be effective starting in 1895, although some sources suggest it was revised to take effect earlier. What was the impact? Well, the reforms laid the groundwork for future municipal government structures, which were later adopted and modified by the American and Filipino governments. One of the most egregious misrepresentations of Spanish modernity, however, is in the area of education. Contrary to US propaganda, it was Spain that first brought free public education in the Philippines in 1863, just a few years after it was implemented in Spain around 1857. In contrast, there was no single organic law at the federal level in the United States in the 1860s that mandated or pushed states to offer free public education across the entire United States. While there were early federal initiatives supporting education, such as the Land Ordinance of 1785 and the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, these did not establish universal free public education nationwide. So Spain and the Philippines were ahead of its time, with one of the first free public school systems in the whole world, and the teaching of Spanish became compulsory. So this idea that Spain never taught Filipinos Spanish because the missionaries learned the native language instead, well, that was true only before 1863, but not after, and is therefore false. In fact, Filipinos spoke Spanish with the fruits of that compulsory education, resulting in the golden age of Spanish literature in the Philippines during the American colonial period. So reforms and progress were being made towards the end of the 19th century. But this was ignored. The whole effort was to show Spain exactly as that cruel and medieval monolith that belonged in the past and had to be replaced by the US. So how much of this did you actually know? Our point here is not to hate the Spanish or the Americans, but to understand Philippine history stripped of the propaganda. Our goal is for Filipinos to ask more questions about what passes as common wisdom in our history and search for truth. If this video helps you become more curious about the Leyenda Negra in Philippine history, then good. And perhaps we Filipinos can unearth together our true history, which we think is still to be really written. If you like this video, please like and subscribe to the channel as we are lining up more myth-busting videos in the future. That's all for now. Vivan los Filipinos!